again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Gousha, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by the author Timothy Snyder. He is the Bird White Housum Professor of History at Yale University. He is the author of more than a half dozen books, award-winning books. Most recently, in 2010, he wrote the bestseller called Bloodlands, which examined Soviet and Nazi atrocities in Eastern Europe. And he followed up on that with the release of this book last year. It's called Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. It is a new explanation of the Holocaust, an explanation of the greatest tragedy in the world in the last century. So won't you please welcome Professor Timothy Snyder to Marquette Law School. So I wanted to begin with the name of the book, Black Earth, which refers to the fertile land in Ukraine. And let's begin there. Why is Ukraine central to the story that you tell in this book?
Okay. So the Black Earth has a number of meanings in this book, but it starts with the most concrete, the most specific, the idea of fertile soil. And it starts there because this is the element that we perhaps most forget about the Second World War, the Holocaust, the German war of colonialism in the East, which led to the Holocaust. You and I, most folks in this room, have grown up in a bubble. We've grown up in the only historical time and place when food did not matter in politics. And for that very reason, we don't understand what it would be like to be complex, sophisticated people in the developed country and yet be concerned about food and resources. We don't know how ideas, how ideologies that appeal to conquest and control of scarce resources, even food, how that might work as politics, how that could reach our minds and hearts. So I start with the idea of Black Earth because the Black Earth, the fertile soil of Ukraine, was the central goal, the main goal of Hitler's war in the East. But of course, I have something broader in mind as well, that when we start thinking about the world in that way, then our own view of the future might turn out to be a bit darker too.
You say in the introduction to this book that our intuitions about the Holocaust fail us. What do you mean by that?
The Holocaust is an interesting event in the U.S. It's one of, I think, the two things that most Americans think we understand, the other one being the Civil War. I know nothing about American history, so I'm not going to judge whether we understand the Civil War. I have my suspicions about that. But with the Holocaust, it's very interesting because we have a certain confidence that we understand it. And certainly as a memorial presence, it's very strong. There are a dozen museums or more. There are monuments in many cities, like my own New Haven. And there was a television miniseries or television movie in the 1980s. There have been many important Hollywood films since. And as a result of all of this, and as a result of our attention to the survivors too, we have an image of what it was. And our image is Auschwitz. Our image is something that we call a camp, although it wasn't really. We have an image of the icon of the railway tracks, which lead from a place we can't see to another place that we can't see. The odd thing about this image is that, and this is sad to say, and you can brace yourselves a little bit, but the sad thing about this image is that it minimizes the Holocaust. It separates us from the Holocaust. What we don't see is how the Holocaust could actually begin. Auschwitz was the end. The Germans developed Auschwitz. They developed these killing facilities with gas so that not so many Germans had to personally take part in the shooting of Jews. That's the end. Auschwitz is the death of 1 million Jews, but 6 million were murdered. And how did the Holocaust begin? The Holocaust began because the Germans realized in the summer of 1941, as they invaded the Soviet Union, that not just the SS, not just the people who were trained for it, but also people who weren't policemen, soldiers, civilian occupation authorities, and not just Germans, but local people in those areas would join in mass killing operations, could take part in something which was clearly industrial killing, although the death factories, Auschwitz, are still years away. So what we fail to see, and I think the reason why we don't have a chance of understanding Auschwitz, is we fail to see that it started with the revelation that people who are very much like us can kill other people very much like us for no particular reason in very, very large numbers, and that this was face-to-face, this was intimate, that this was brutal. The other thing that we don't see, it goes back to your first question a bit, is where this happened. When we think about Auschwitz, we think about the survivors, and this is again another way that Auschwitz is really unusual. Auschwitz, the death facility, wasn't a camp. If you were on one of those trains and you were selected for murder, Auschwitz wasn't a camp for you. It was a place where you were killed. But next to the death facility at Auschwitz, there was a camp. And in that camp, there were some survivors. And those survivors wrote memoirs. And in the world of the Cold War of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, those memoirs by people like Primo Levi could reach us. And this is very important, but it only gave us a very partial sense of what was happening. And those people, Italian like Primo Levi, or German like Anne Frank, those people whose memoirs or whose recollections reached us, they were usually exceptional, because the Italians and the French, and even the Germans, are a very, very small part of the victims of the Holocaust. The huge majority of victims of the Holocaust were Polish Jews, Soviet Jews, people whose lives and whose deaths were largely forgotten because right after the Second World War begins the Cold War, and the Cold War locks us away from access to documents and memories and death pits, which is how the Holocaust started and how roughly half of it continued.
I want to, you mentioned where this begins, and I think there is this notion that this begins with Adolf Hitler being this German nationalist, and he rises to power during a time of economic hardship in Germany. But your point is that you do not see Hitler as a German nationalist. You have called him a racial anarchist or a zoological anarchist. What do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. What I mean by that was that Hitler was both a politician and an ideologist. I mean, often when we're confronted by people who have powerful and dangerous ideas, we dismiss them in one way or another. We say, well, he was just a pragmatist. He just said those things to come to power, you know, and then they come to power and then they do the terrible things that they do, right? Or we say he was crazy, right? He was a madman. But had he been a madman, he wouldn't have won elections, right? Had he been a madman, he wouldn't have been able to transform the German state. Had he been a madman, he wouldn't have been able to command, you know, what was a very successful in many ways war, right? He wasn't a madman, he wasn't a pragmatist. He was a good politician. He was someone who knew how to manipulate the very real political emotions of Germans. He wasn't a German nationalist himself. He didn't care about Germans as such, but he knew what Germans cared about. You may know some politicians like this. He didn't care at all about his own society, but he knew how to talk to the emotions of his society. He was a very good technician of power. And he had a worldview, as you say, not a view of nations, but a view of races. He had a very clear view of the world. His view of the world was this, that the planet had only so much fertile soil, only so many resources. It was a finite space. That's what he says on the first page of Mein Kampf. It's a finite space. We are not human beings. There's no such thing as humanity. We are members of races. And the destiny of races is to struggle for that land, the same way that he thinks species struggle in the natural order. Races must struggle. That is what we do. And if we are doing anything else, if we're having a civilized conversation, if we have political institutions, if we have laws, if we believe in human solidarity, if we believe in Catholic mercy, if we believe in any idea of reciprocity, which allows me to see you and you to see me as human beings, that idea, says Hitler, is Jewish, okay? So his view of the world as a world of racial struggle is the same as his anti-Semitism. So you can't with Hitler say, oh, he was a nationalism, but just more of a nationalist. That's not right. He was a kind of anarchist who thought you had to clear away institutions and then see who won. And with Hitler also, with his anti-Semitism, of course he was an anti-Semite, but to say he was an anti-Semite in a way doesn't cover it, because he wasn't just an anti-Semite who then just turned the knob a little bit more and more and more until you reach Hitler. You know, the guy that in the golf club, you know, who doesn't like Jews, and you turn and turn and you get to Hitler. It's not like that. His anti-Semitism says Jews have destroyed the planetary order because Jews have transformed human beings into something they are not. What we are races. We are killing machines. We are people who seek out land and kill others and starve others on the way. We're not doing that because the Jews have despoiled our souls and despoiled our minds. And therefore, and this is chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, therefore the Jews have to be removed from the planet. So he's not a nationalist who has some prejudices. He's somebody who has a coherent worldview, a worldview which can only be acted out in a war of colonization where lots of political institutions are destroyed.
He found some inspiration, I think you write, from America and what happened to Native American people in this country.
Yeah, one of the lovely things about history is the way that you're always working against what people think. I mean, I like to contrast history and memory. I had a friend, a colleague called Tony Jett, who used to speak of history as being the ugly sister of memory, right? Memory is much more attractive because memory is the way we would like to think things turn out, right? Like if you ask yourself honestly, like what's the way that you use your own memory most of the time, it's to explain how things had to turn out the way they did or why you were right and somebody else was wrong. I mean, unless you're a very reflective person. And as nations and as societies, we're generally not very reflective. And so national memory and national history even tends to turn towards justifications and explanations and apologies. It smooths out rough corners. And so it can be a shock when we actually do history, which is actually in its core never national and always international, always transnational. Hitler in the 1920s looks at the United States and he sees a success story. In Hitler's view, we are a country of Scandinavians and Germans, people he called Aryans, who successfully used slave labor to exterminate local populations over a vast and fertile terrain. And then we applied technology to create the most prosperous society in the history of the world. That's Hitler's positive example. Not only that, the thing that we call the American dream is at the core of Hitler's idea. And this is the real, I mean, it's disconcerting that he so clearly sees the things that we didn't see at the time and often still don't, namely the history of African Americans and the history of Native Americans in this country. But it's perhaps more disconcerting what he thinks of the American dream. Because what he thinks of the American dream is that's completely normal. In fact, you should never think about the people who are suffering and dying for your way of life, right? Because racial solidarity is the only thing that matters, the Americans were absolutely right to exterminate people far and near, to become, not just to survive, right, but to become wealthy. And this is where things get disconcerting because he blurs what we would call the American dream, what we would call a way of life, into the idea that he calls Lebensraum, which means living space. Lebensraum for him is on the one hand is biological. He says races are like species. We have to compete for a habitat, but it's also sociological. It's also cultural. Lebensraum is not just about physical survival. It's about having the highest standard of living in the world. So in the end, Hitler says, we Germans, we must conquer Ukraine. Going back to your first question, we must conquer Ukraine the same way that the Americans conquered the Great Plains. Right? This is his analogy. And they had more time. They had decades to do it. We must do it in a few months. And we have to do it to catch up to the Americans. So I have found, coming back to the United States, that this tends to be disconcerting for Americans sometimes. But it is not that he's right about American history, right? I mean, he misses certain important aspects of American history. But it does give some pause for thought.
Statelessness. This is a theme in your book about why things happened where they happened. And I want to begin this part of the conversation by talking about Hitler's decision to go into Austria. So the Nazis go into Austria. What lessons did they learn from the Austrian experience that they applied as they moved forward with Hitler's planning?
Okay, let me reel back to your earlier very good question about our image of the Holocaust, because that bears on this. When we think about the Holocaust, if we have a kind of canonical sense of how the Holocaust happened, it has to do with the rise of Hitler, of course, very important. It has to do with the increasing oppression of Jews inside Germany, right? We might remember the boycotts of the spring of 1933, the Nuremberg laws, which made Jews second-class citizens. We might remember the expropriation of Jewish property, which reaches a peak in 1938. We might remember Kristallnacht, the nationwide pogrom of November 1938, in which something like 200 Jews are killed. We might remember these things, and then we think those are in some way the beginning of the Holocaust. Now, that's not entirely wrong, but it's also not sufficient, because there's another way of looking at all of that. If you just forget for a moment that you know the Holocaust is going to happen, the scale of Jewish suffering as of November 1938, although terrible by the standards of the time, it's nothing like a Holocaust. 200 people being killed in street violence. I mean, let's face it, Americans, like that is not an event which is of a completely unfamiliar scale, right? 200 people being killed on the streets is not the same thing as 6 million people being murdered. There's a big jump from one to the other. Or to push the logic even a little bit further, The Holocaust just didn't happen in interwar Germany. It just didn't, right? If Germany hadn't begun a Second World War, if German power hadn't moved beyond Germany, we would be looking at an anti-Semitic state among other anti-Semitic states. We would be saying, was Nazi Germany really that much worse than interwar Romania? We would be saying, how is it different? How is it similar to interwar Poland? The Holocaust is something that happens only after German power breaks out of Germany. And now I'm going to try to answer your question, because this is the part that we miss. When Germany goes into Austria in March of 1938, it's not that the Austrians are such worse anti-Semites than the Germans. That would be absurd. It's not that the Austrians have passed the same anti-Semitic laws as the Germans have, because they haven't. The difference is that from one day to the next, the Austrian state ceases to exist, which means that Jews float free suddenly and completely of state protection. And it means that their neighbors, literally their neighbors, especially in Vienna, who know that now that Nazi German power is coming, do whatever they can to separate themselves from the Jews symbolically, right? Physically, politically. So these famous or these notorious scenes that you might have seen yourself, these photographs of Jews scrubbing the streets in March of 1938 in Vienna. What are they doing? They're being humiliated, yes. This is a step towards the Holocaust, of course, but it's also politically significant. Because what they're scrubbing from the streets, it's not just the streets, they're scrubbing the word Austria from the streets. There was going to be a referendum a few days later about the independence of Austria. Now that everyone knows that Austria is not going to exist, the Jews are associated with the previous system, and their fate is associated with its future, which is no future at all. The Jews scrubbing the streets is humiliation. We get that because we understand about symbols. What we don't get is the politics, that this is the moment when Austria ceases to exist. And as the Germans succeed in destroying states ever more radically, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Soviet Union, then the final solution, this idea we've discussed in Hitler's mind of a world without Jews, of a world which is saved because of the extermination of Jews, that idea can then become practice.
The final solution, let's touch on that, because there was a time where the Soviets and the Nazis were cooperating. They had their non-aggression pact, and they were kind of splitting up the spoils. But that ended in 1941, I think June of 41, when Hitler decided to mass 3 million German soldiers and move on the Soviet Union. But that did not go as planned. The final solution really came about because of their military failure, didn't it? Well, the Germans' military failure.
There's certainly something in that, but I'd ask us to think about what you're describing in military terms, also in political terms. So between Vienna and Austria, which we were just talking about, and the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, what happens in Europe? What happens in Europe is the end of the European political order. Austria is destroyed, Czechoslovakia is destroyed, Munich, Poland is destroyed, but also Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are destroyed. This is a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union come to a military alliance in August and September of 1939. So 6 European states have been removed from the map. And if you can remove 6 states from the map, that means that the order no longer functions. Ideas of territorial integrity, sovereignty, the things that we take for granted, they no longer function, which means that by the time that Germany invades the Soviet Union, which, as you quite rightly say, is the major turning point, many things have changed in people's lives. So where does the Holocaust actually start? And here I have to focus on our really weak point, which is geography. When Germany invades the Soviet Union, what is it invading? It's invading the places that the Soviet Union has just invaded, right? Well, Americans, we have trouble with occupation, which is good. I mean, I don't wish for that to be a familiar concept, unless it's a Canadian occupation, in which case, you know, absolutely. But in general, like the notion of what life would be like under occupation, I mean, unless some folks here are emigres, is something which is pretty alien to us. But occupation changes your relationship to the law, right? It forces you into compromises. Imagine an occupation which is not just a normal occupation, but one which says your state doesn't exist, your previous laws don't exist, you're not citizens of anything, you have no rights, including property rights. Your behavior, I'm sad to say, all of our behavior would change very much. That is what both German state destruction did and Soviet state destruction did. That's what the Soviets did in 39 and 40. When the Germans invade the Soviet Union in 41, here comes the tricky part. They're invading first the places which the Soviet Union had already invaded. The Soviet Union destroys political apparati, install their own, and then the Germans destroy the Soviet ones. And it's in this very special place where the state destruction is double that the Germans find they could do things that they themselves did not expect they could do. For example, shoot people in very large numbers. For example, persuade local people to help them do it.
You've called some of those people, I think, entrepreneurs. Explain that phrase, entrepreneurs. Is it violence? I'm trying to remember, yeah.
Entrepreneurs of violence. So the SS, the German SS, what are the SS? If we see the SS in a film, we see men in uniform. And when we see men in uniform, we think of the state, right? We think of forces of order. But that is not what the SS were. The SS were not just glorified policemen or a paramilitary force. The SS were the people who believed in the kinds of ideas that we were discussing earlier. The SS were racial anarchists in the way that we've described. Inside the German state, from 33 to 39, from 1933 to 1939, what did the SS do? They were the guards of the concentration camps. Why is that so important? Because concentration camps, right, as they teach you in law school, are places where the law does not function. Like, that's the definition of a concentration camp. It's a place of no law. It's a zone of no law, or it's a zone of no state, right? The SS are not a state institution. They're a party organization. They don't believe in the rule of law. They represent something totally different. They don't represent an oppressive law. They represent the idea that the only law is the law of nature. They represent the idea that the racial struggle is the only reality. So the concentration camps that they guard, why am I dwelling on this? Because the concentration camps, horrible as they are just a kind of small template for the way the SS is going to govern Europe, where they get to govern, govern's the wrong word, where they get to rule, where they get to exercise power. They're entrepreneurs of violence in the sense that they believe that the law of the jungle is where we should go. And when they are released into places like Poland or the Baltic states or the Soviet Union, they very quickly find ways to exploit the disorder that they encounter and to transform it into the kind of destruction that they think is normal. So state destruction is not just something that happens. It's not just a situation which is inherently very dangerous. And if you can't picture what I'm talking about, just think of a few days in New Orleans, right? Just a few days in New Orleans, a few years in Iraq, right? That's just a little taste of what we're talking about. But there can be situations like that which are consciously exploited by people who think that this is good, that this is a step towards a kind of utopia. That's the SS.
There's a line in your book that stuck with me, and you talked about how we explain the barbarity of what we saw in some of these countries and were stateless places at that point. You talked about the barbarity, and we want to attribute that to, I think you say, extravagant anti-Semitism. But you say it would be a mistake. It would be an error for us to simply attribute this barbarity to that. What would be the error in seeing it that way?
Okay, so to be very clear, anti-Semitism is a bad thing. We should condemn it. It was central. It was central to Hitler's worldview. You can't imagine the war without anti-Semitism. You can't imagine the Holocaust without anti-Semitism. It's a central part, but it's not the only thing that happens. And the idea, which we like or we're drawn to, that the Holocaust was caused by anti-Semitism and that one can line those things up in a simple way, that is far, far too optimistic. It's far too optimistic. Historically, it's far too optimistic because many people who killed Jews were not anti-Semites, or at least they weren't anti-Semites until they killed Jews. And after they killed Jews, they then expressed anti-Semitic views because although we're very good at lying and we're very good at killing as a species, once we kill, we have to have some story we think is true to explain why we've killed. But many people who killed Jews historically were not anti-Semites. Some of the major collaborators in Eastern Europe, including the most important one, there's no sign whatever that they were anti-Semites. Many of the people who collaborated with the Germans had already collaborated with the Soviets. And as soon as one understands that, one realizes that it can't have been ideological commitment in every case. The reason why it's too optimistic in contemporary terms is that we think, okay, so long as I'm not an anti-Semite and you're not an anti-Semite, then everything's all right. everything's not all right, because views like this can change very quickly. Anti-Semitism can become much more important in a place like Germany, which is, let's face it, just as sophisticated, probably better educated, probably better at deferring gratification than we are. Views on things like anti-Semitism can switch very quickly, right? The level of anti-Semitism or the relevance or the salience of it can change very quickly from the 1920s to the 1930s. And once Hitler gets the Germans into a war, it can become much more salient indeed. But people who in 1945 believed that Jews ran the world and that this was a Jewish war, they didn't necessarily think that in Germany in 1935 or in 1925. As far as an explanation of the Holocaust, right? We would like it to be the explanation because it's so elegant, but in a way, the whole question forces us to think in a more complex way, and in a way which I think is more useful for the present and future. The places that we think are most anti-Semitic are not the places where the Holocaust happens. That's the main problem for this line of reasoning. Or the places where anti-Semitism was not a major problem are the places where it does happen. Right? So the Soviet Union, for example, which is the only anti-Semitic country in the world in the 1920s and 1930s, anti-Semitism is a crime, right? Mixed marriages are very popular and so on. The death rates in the occupied Soviet Union are 95%, which is exactly the same as Poland, where public anti-Semitism was a major problem, where a major political party was anti-Semitic, where the government openly said 90% of the Jews should leave. And yet the outcome in the Holocaust is exactly the same, right? Or if you look at France and the Netherlands was the one country in interwar Europe, in Western Europe, where people would have said anti-Semitism is not a major problem, and yet 75% of the Jews die. In France is the country in Western Europe where pretty much everyone would have agreed that anti-Semitism was a problem, and yet 75% of the Jews survive. I could go on like this with pretty much every country. It's striking how, like, if you tried to predict where the Holocaust was going to happen, from the point of view of 1938, you would have gotten it all wrong, right? That's the thing, you know. The places where anti-Semitism was prominent is not where it actually, even Germany, right? You'd think, well, 100% of the Jews must have died in Germany, but that's not the case. Most of the Jews in Germany survive. So if you're going to look for a reason why the Holocaust happens, where it happens, you have to have something else. And that something else is the destruction of institutions. In order to kill a Jew, yes, there has to be this worldview which imagines a world without them. But in order for that to be realized, what has to be cleared away are the institutions and the laws which connect Jews to their neighbors and connect them to the state. The Nazis, this is an amazing thing, but the Nazis only killed Jews who were made stateless. When they killed Bulgarian Jews, you have Eichmann writing Bulgaria saying, please, reassure me that you have not given these people citizenship, right? When Romania in 1943 decides that it's going to regard its Jews as citizens again, the Romanian Jews who are waiting in transit camps in Drancy, in France, to be deported to Auschwitz, all of a sudden they don't go anymore because Romania sees them now as its citizens. And the simplest way to separate people from the state, and this is what the Germans learn, and this is the thing that we don't get because Hannah Arendt and Raoul Hilberg and all the very smart people who started our discussion of the Holocaust didn't get it. The simplest way to separate people from the state is to destroy the state. It's not to have pogroms and boycotts and Nuremberg laws. Those things are bad enough. But the simplest way to get people outside of state protection is just to destroy the state.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the personal stories you tell in this book. And obviously you felt that was an important component of this story. Why did you choose to highlight stories of people who rescued Jewish people, helped Jewish people? What was it that motivated you to include that in this piece of analysis and explanation?
Thanks for that question. It's the history of rescue is it's really a question of what history can do and what it can't. So when you're writing the history of the Holocaust, you're faced with two borders, right, that are very difficult and that you have to acknowledge and get as close to them as you can, but not cross them. At one end, there's the border, which is Hitler's mind, right? Explaining the worldview, as we tried to do very briefly here, making the worldview comprehensible, while at the same time preserving distance from it. If you don't make it comprehensible, you haven't done your job, right? But it's a very difficult and painful place to be. The other border at the other end, the other metaphysical border, is rescue. Because you can explain rescue up to a point. I mean, for me, history is about explanation. You've probably gathered this. For me, it's not about memory. It's a little about description. It's mostly about explanation. Rescue is something we can explain up to a point. If we follow, the logic that we've already begun, having to do with states and institutions, we actually can understand a lot of rescue, because rescue is the other side of survival. In a place like France, people were still citizens under German rule. People courageously rescued Jews, but it's not the same courage as the courage of somebody in Poland or the Soviet Union, where if you're trying to save a Jew, the penalty is death, right? It's just not the same thing. The people who were hiding Anne Frank in the Netherlands was courageous, but it wasn't even a crime. It wasn't even illegal what they were doing. They weren't punished for it, right? That's why we have the books afterwards. They weren't punished because it wasn't a crime, and it wasn't a crime because the Netherlands was still a state. So we can explain rescue to some extent institutionally. A really good example of this are diplomats, actually. Almost everybody who saved more than 100 Jews was a diplomat. Why is that? Because diplomats are better people than the rest of us? No, because first, you can't take a diplomat's citizenship away. It's very hard anyway. And second, diplomats have, in this context, the almost magical power to extend state recognition to other people, right? So hence, the Chinese consul in Vienna saves a couple thousand people. The Japanese consul in Kaunas in Lithuania saves around 10,000 people. There are multiple Spanish, Portuguese diplomats, un-American diplomat, who also save hundreds of people by giving them pieces of paper. Raoul Hilberg, who was not really a diplomat, he was kind of a failed businessman who had, in the middle of his life, made this dramatic decision that he was going to be a Swedish diplomat and go to Budapest. He saves thousands of Jews. How? By giving them pieces of paper, which reconnect them to the state, and therefore they can survive, right? So the history of the institution can, up to a point, help us see why people survive. Partisan armies, churches, institutions that are a bit like a state, a bit not like a state. Sometimes they kill Jews. Sometimes they rescue Jews. When we get down to the individual rescuers, and we try to explain why they did what they did, especially in the worst of times and places where they had no institutional support, sometimes we find motives. They were childless couples wanted a child. Lonely people wanted someone else in the house. Sometimes we find human motives, but you can go to a level even beyond that and find individuals where even those motives don't apply. And then the question is, why do they do what they do? And this is what I mean by the other boundary of history, because there reaches a point where you can't say, that is, everything that you've learned about structures or about history no longer explains to you the actions of these individuals. And that's why I ended the book with them, because that, I think, is where the story ends. There are people who rescued even though they were risking death. There are people who rescued for no reason, in the sense of sociological reason, political reason, economic reason, right? Because the economics was all against this. If you're in Poland or the Soviet Union, if you try to save a Jew and your neighbor sees you doing it, a neighbor reports you, the Jew is killed, you're very likely killed, the Jew's property goes to the neighbor, and your property very likely goes to the neighbor as well. So if you're looking at this from the point of view of microeconomics 101, which many people, of course, urge us to do about everything in life, if you look at that just from that point of view, then no one is going to rescue Jews. You're acting against your economic interests, you're acting against pretty much every kind of interest you can conceive when you do it, and yet some people did. That, I think, has to be recorded, and it has to be understood as having happened, even though we can't quite understand it. But there's a further point to this, which is what we very often do with rescue is we say, aha, okay, someone rescued, and therefore we're all redeemed. And what I'm trying to show is, yes, some people rescued, but we would not have rescued. The huge majority of us in those situations would not have rescued. If we tear away the institutions and the laws, we would not behave the way we behave now. The rescuers I call the righteous few because they were righteous, but also because they were few. And then this turns us back to what the political lesson is. The political lesson then becomes not the Hollywood version, which is wait till the last minute and then do something dramatic. Because if you wait till the last minute, first of all, you won't do the dramatic thing anyway, you'll fail. But even if you succeed, you're succeeding as the catastrophe is already happening, right? The whole idea of rescue means the catastrophe has already happened. The political lesson can't be rescue in that sense. The political lesson has to be, how do we maintain the structures, which means we don't get to the last minute.
Well, let's get into that, because the book is called Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. And the last chapter of this book has been very provocative. A lot of people have had different reactions to it, but I would say the last chapter challenges us to think about what is possible and what we are capable of. What concerns you most as we move towards the future and the possibility of something similar to this happening again?
So the interesting thing about the Holocaust and the present is that pretty much everybody has an idea about how the Holocaust relates to the present and future. I mean, as you say, I've gotten challenged for drawing lessons for the present and the future from the Holocaust. But everybody does that. The question is what lesson? And what I find, and you can correct me afterwards if you know of examples, but what I find is that people generally take the Holocaust to confirm the way they see the world anyway, right? It's not that frequent that one finds someone who says, I went through life as a libertarian, then I learned about the Holocaust and now I'm a social democrat. Or, I went through life as this and I learned about the Holocaust and now I'm that. In general, people find ways to make the Holocaust suit whatever ideas they already hold on other grounds. I'm sorry to be cynical, but I'm afraid that's what I find. Whereas I think the Holocaust was such a rupture, such a central event of the century, that if full knowledge of its scope and its causes doesn't challenge us, to use your very good word, if it doesn't challenge us, then we've missed something, right? If learning about it doesn't shake up the way we see things, then we haven't really learned about it. So I accept the lessons that everyone accepts. I accept that the Holocaust means that anti-Semitism is a bad thing. I accept the lesson, this is the lowest common denominator lesson of American museums, as you might have noticed, that one should be tolerant and one should defend one's neighbor when the majority turns against one's neighbor. Of course, I think that's true. I accept also the lessons that Germans draw. I agree, Germans should be nice. I agree, Germans should have a democracy. I agree, they should have a rule of law state. I'm just not sure that these things, these kinds of lowest common denominator lessons that are acceptable to everyone in the given society, exhaust what is to be learned. In fact, I'm sure those things do not exhaust what is to be learned. If I'm right about the Holocaust, right, there are three basic features to it, all of which we've talked about. One is Hitler's view of the world, his idea that everything is a racial struggle, that resources matter, that the only thing that matters in politics is solidarity with those who are racially closest to you, enmity for everyone else. If someone tells you anything else, that person is a Jew, right? The anti-Semitism. The second thing, the destruction of states, which, by the way, is not just my argument. That's what the scholars of ethnic cleansing and genocide say. The study of the Holocaust is often fenced off from other episodes of mass killing, but there's a whole body of social science which says it's not strong states that kill people, it's generally states that are falling apart. It's generally in conditions of state failure that ethnic cleansing takes place. And what's special about Nazi Germany is that it was a state that cultivated an institution, the SS, to destroy other states and then take advantage of the anarchy, right? Not a strong state, but a state that destroyed other states. So statelessness is lesson number 2. And lesson number 3 is how we think about ecology, right? How we think about the world around us. The Germans had reasons to be concerned about access to food. How will we, or perhaps more to the point, how will the Chinese behave when they are in a similar situation, right? Is it just maybe the case that China, which is, like Germany, a rising economic power which depends upon exports and which has much bigger problems with food than Germany did, and has problems with water, which is something entirely new, is it just possible that their massive investments in Eastern Africa could be a problem in the future? Is it just possible that as they look ahead north to the water and the natural gas in eastern Siberia, that might just perhaps be a problem? When I look at all of this, Mike, the point is not that the Holocaust as such will repeat itself in the same form. The point is that if we understand the causes of the Holocaust as causes, we can see where one or two of these things line up. Because in Rwanda, You did have the coincidence of ecological and racial issues. In Darfur in the Sudan, you had the coincidence of ecological and racial issues. In Syria today, what's happening in Syria today, many things, but part of it is we dismantled the Iraqi state. 1.5 million Iraqis fled to Syria. Then global warming does away with a thing which we always like to call the Fertile Crescent. Nice phrase, no longer exists. 2 million more Syrian internal migrants. That is one of the causes of the unrest in Syria, right? A state element and an ecological element, and then here you are in Syria with the catastrophe that it is, with the textbook genocide of the Yazidi people in the middle of it. So what I'm trying to do is not to say that the Holocaust repeats itself over and over again. That would be mindless, right? What I'm trying to say is that if we actually think that it's the central event of the 20th century, if we really think that, and that's not just something that we say in order to put it behind plexiglass, then, because we put important things behind plexiglass, or we mount them on the wall or whatever, the things that are really important we don't put behind plexiglass, we don't mount them on the wall, we don't turn them into plaques, the things that are really important we learn from. And that if we actually learn from it, things that we know are awful, things that are a bit unfamiliar start to look a little more unfamiliar and maybe a little more comprehensible.
One final point, and that is, you notice something about this country, and I think this is something that you even hear in politics today. I mean, many people in America feel that freedom is the absence of the state. Does that concern you based on your knowledge of what happened during World War II?
Yeah, the idea that freedom is the absence of the state is the error that you can afford when you have a functional state, right? It's a luxury view. It's a kind of political adolescence, and then political adulthood comes the moment when you're confronted with how you and your neighbors will behave when there's not a state. Which isn't to say that states are always good. States can be better. They can be worse. But the idea that freedom is anarchy leads to situations in which there will obviously be oppression and bloodshed. So it's all very elegant to imagine that, yes, we should have an ever smaller state, let's drown it in the bathtub. But if you drown the state in the bathtub, then everyone else is going to drown as well. I mean, there's a very simple example of this which we're confronted with right now. Let's imagine it's true that our elections are rigged. They don't mean anything. What follows from that? What follows immediately from that is we fight it out on the streets. Are we freer when we fight it out on the streets than maybe it's more fun. Maybe some of us will enjoy it. Some of us will. Some of us will enjoy fighting out on the streets, right? But is that actually freedom? Is it actually freedom to have our political process be decided by violence on the streets, as to a large extent it was in Germany in 32 and 33? Because people didn't take elections completely seriously, right? Is that actually freedom? Because that's what removing the state means. Removing the state means saying things like, and this is one of the things that the Nazis said, it means saying things like, Parliament's a joke, elections don't really count, right? You do away with those procedures, okay, that's fine. There's going to be a moment of great joy and euphoria. But is that really freedom? Americans and Europeans, too, to a large extent, can imagine various things would be preferable to what they have now because we have forgotten. We have forgotten. This is an interesting thing about the historical moment. I mean, we never learned to some extent, but also we've forgotten, not just things like hunger, like we talked about before, like the generation of the Great Depression, which would have understood some of the things I'm saying about hunger here, has largely passed on. The generation that remembers the late 1930s when the European states collapsed before the Second World War, they've largely passed on. What we remember is our abstractions. What we remember tend to be images, but they're very specific things that we are vulnerable to, just as Europeans were vulnerable to. And we will learn, unfortunately, what I'm afraid of is we're going to learn those things in practice. I would rather we didn't learn them in practice, right? I would rather our state institutions continued to function.
Let's take a few questions from the audience in our remaining time. If you're in the seating bowl down here, you press on the rim. You don't put your finger on the ball, but on the rim and just hold it down. Okay, actually we're going to use microphones for everything today since we're broadcasting this. Ryan has one, John has one. Raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. And please keep your questions brief if you would. Thank you. We'll start over here.
How do you feel religion affected the Holocaust?
So, thank you for asking the question in such a general way, because
I'm not trying to, you talk about blaming
Yeah.
Any other churches?
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating thing. And I'm going to tell you a couple things that I've found, which may be a little surprising, but hopefully it'll be interesting. One thing to think about is the way that Christian religiosity permeates and is perverted in Hitler's worldview, right? I think this is something that no Christian confronting this can overlook. Because what Hitler does in Mein Kampf is he takes it's not so much that he takes traditional Christian anti-Semitism and uses that. That's not so important. But what he does is he takes Christian ideas like martyrdom, right? And he uses them to different purposes. And so people who are Christian, I think, should attend to that text as a way that a worldview can be moved around, right? Hitler himself was obviously not a Christian. He's not an extreme Christian any more than he's an extreme nationalist. He's something else. But when I read Mein Kampf, I'm struck by the way he very skillfully uses ideas such as redemption, salvation, right? The world will be saved, redeemed somehow when the Jews are gone. That he uses these ideas very carefully. That's one connection with religion, which is a little unsettling. The second connection is more sociological. It's when we look at rescue, to go back to this question, it turns out that it's not the variety of people's faith which turns out to matter. What turns out to matter is sociologically, generally, is whether their experience of religion was also experience of being an outsider. So in France and the Netherlands, it wasn't that Protestants rescued and Catholics didn't, or vice versa. It was that, I find this so interesting, it was that Catholics in places where Catholics were a minority before the war were more likely to rescue, and Protestants in places where they were a minority were more likely to rescue. If we push further east into Ukraine, into a place that I know pretty well, what one finds, and I think this was true in Poland too, what one finds is that radical Protestant denominations, or places that were seen as radical Protestant denominations in that context, Methodists, Stundists, those people were Baptists, much more likely to rescue than their neighbors. Why? Because they were of a religion which was used to being on the outside, and therefore, and this is the point, this is how it fits the argument, when the state goes away, their behavior doesn't change much because their behavior wasn't so much determined by predictable institutions and laws, right? So, and then if you look at the individual level, take Poland now. The Polish Catholic Church, like European Catholic churches in general, up in the interwar period was teaching that the Jews are responsible for the death of Christ traditionally, but also teaching something else, which is the Jews are responsible for the problems of modernity, including communism. That was a very unhelpful thing to be teaching before the Second World War, as it turns out, because that's a view that Hitler himself also takes. Hitler's idea that the Jews are responsible for all ideas of human solidarity, that includes everything. It includes capitalism, because capitalism has contracts, but it also includes communism, right? So the idea that Jews are responsible for communism and capitalism was a place where Hitler's more extreme view overlapped with things that priests in Poland and elsewhere were preaching. Unfortunately, that didn't help. But where I'm going with this is, what's interesting about Catholic rescuers in Poland is that they were the readers of the Bible. So, and what they cited to a really striking degree was the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is an interesting thing to be citing, I find, for a lot of reasons. For one thing, they're taking a stand which is different than very often what their own priests, unfortunately, were telling them, because the idea had been that Jews were not our neighbor. But the other thing which is interesting about the parable of the Good Samaritan is that the parable of the Good Samaritan is about people helping people who are not like them, right? In the parable of the Good Samaritan, a Jew is not helped by another Jew. He's helped by someone who's from an enemy group, the Samaritans, right? And the other thing which is so interesting about that story is that it's, the parable, I may be taking this too far, for my lovely Catholic audience, but the interesting thing is that it's a story of Jews discussing Leviticus, right? That parable is itself Jews talking about the meaning of Leviticus, like which commandment is the most important after loving God. The most important commandment is to love thy neighbor. Who is thy neighbor, right? He that showed mercy, go and do likewise. That's what they tend to cite. It's an individualist thing. They're reading it against the grain of what they've been taught. And that's the story of the church and the Holocaust in general. Individuals who were somehow out of things, nuns, for example, Catholic nuns, much more likely to rescue. Why? Females in a male church, outposts away from the city, right? People who for some reason or another had decided to leave their families, you know. In that situation, people who were religious were more likely to save.
Take a question up there, yes.
Yes. Considering the great man theory of history, in your opinion, would or could have the Holocaust have happened if Hitler would have died in the First World War, or if he would not have been so charismatic?
Yeah. So I'm going to agree with your question, but disagree with its premise. The great man of theory of history would say the only thing that matters is great men, but the way to answer the question is to point out that other things matter a lot as well. And this is something I was just working over with my students yesterday. We're doing the history of Eastern Europe, and we're up to the 17th century, and my students are they're just waiting for the moment when it's all about the Second War and all about the Holocaust. And I'm trying to explain to them that in the 17th century, it's not just that people didn't know that the Holocaust was coming. It's not just they were living in a completely different world. It wasn't coming. You know, that's not how history works. History isn't just a kind of procession of things that, you know, proceed automatically. There's chance, there's choice, there are all kinds of things we don't know about. So I agree with you. I think I agree with you. The Holocaust would not have happened without Hitler, but that is because Hitler was one of the several things that were necessary for the Holocaust, right? He didn't bring it about all by himself. He was a necessary condition among several other necessary conditions, like the anxiety of Germans in the 1920s and 30s, like the Great Depression, like the ideological conflict between far right and far left, like the fragility of the European system, and so on and so on and so on. He was a major precondition, but he was only one of the preconditions. So, my favorite way to put this would be in November of 1939, Hitler was almost assassinated. He was almost assassinated by a trade union organizer. Because of weather and mud, he left 45 minutes earlier than he was going to. Otherwise, he probably would have been killed by a bomb, right? Had that happened, there would have been no Holocaust, I believe, as we understand it, right? But that doesn't mean that only great men make history. It means that he was one condition among others of this thing happening.
I've got time for one final question. Brief question and unfortunately brief answer too.
Have you documented in your book what FDR knew before 1941? Is FDR in the index in your book?
That's a tough one to do briefly because it's really, I've noticed America is sort of a zone of freedom for me because I'm not an American historian, right? I'm an American, but I'm not an American historian. But one thing I've noticed as a historian of the Holocaust looking at America is that this has become highly politicized, with a very interestingly strong current saying that FDR, was a terrible human being and could have done a whole lot more and so on. FDR was operating. See, it's much worse. It's always much worse than we think. FDR was operating within a very anti-Semitic American society where German propaganda said it's a Jewish war, and a lot of Americans believed that. Right, and Jewish organizations had to be very careful because they were afraid that if they said too much about Hitler, then they would be confirming Hitler's propaganda that the war was a Jewish war. So FDR was operating in a set of constraints which we like to forget because we're Americans and we like to forget the bad parts of our own history. That's natural. Within those constraints, FDR was much more concerned, I would say, with the fate of the Jews than most people at the time would have been. The United States did actually organize one of the very few policies in the world which was designed to save Jews. There was no Soviet policy to save Jews. Nobody specifically designed policies to save Jews except Poland, which had a very small one called Żegota, and the United States, which had something called the War Refugees Board, where, why was it called the War Refugees Board? Why wasn't it called the Committee to Save Lots of Jews? I leave that to you, right? Why wasn't it called that in America in the 1940s? It was called the War Refugees Board, and the idea was to recruit diplomats from neutral countries who we were trying to make feel bad about their cooperation with Germany, and essentially telling them, if they go along with us on this, we will treat them better after the war. So we were trying to gather diplomats from neutral countries. The only success was Raoul Wallenberg, precisely. So Raoul Wallenberg, who saved thousands of Hungarian Jews in Budapest, was paid by American money and was working for the United States, and that was FDR's idea. So, you know, in the circumstances, FDR did something. Right? The whole business about how he didn't care, like, you know, that's just not right. My view of FDR would be that in the circumstances, he was aware of the problem, and and skillful politician that he was, he managed to do something at a time when there were major issues in Congress, major issues, as everybody knows, with the State Department, which was a pretty anti-Semitic organization back then, at major issues, you know, in trying to carry out rescue in general. He actually managed to do something. We did have a policy which saved a few thousand Jews. That is terrifyingly not enough. And our record is not something of which we can be proud. And, you know, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is about to finally have an exhibition on American anti-Semitism and the reaction to Jewish migrants in the 1930s. And it's, you know, it's about time, because if we don't understand ourselves, then we can't understand anyone else, right? And my whole point in this discussion, for which I'm very grateful, is that the Holocaust is something that we not only have to understand, but that we can understand, because some elements of it just aren't that far away, either from the world as we know or from the world as we unfortunately might be about to know.
We're going to wrap things up. Before we go, I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today for this discussion. Thanks for your interest and your attention. But most of all, thanks to the author of Black Earth, The Holocaust is History and Mourning, Professor Timothy Snyder. Professor, good to see you again.